Hey folks, welcome to a bonus broadcast of Resistance Live. It's the 8th of June for 2025. Excuse me. And we're here to talk about everything that's going on in Los Angeles. Had a ton of questions over on the Patreon feed when I announced this. So I will just mention at the top, if you want to know when bonus broadcasts are coming, please become a paid subscriber over at patreon.com/resistancelive. Those guys got announcements at 7 a.m. I think it was 7 or 8 a.m. Eastern today that we were going to do this today, because of everything that's been happening in LA over the last 48 plus hours. Okay, so the primary reason why I wanted to come on here was to talk about the deployment of the National Guard in addition to everything that's going on. But let's just back up a second and kind of talk about the framing of this, all right? Because I'm seeing just an enormous amount of folks being really terrified about this particular declaration. And I have to say that I think that's the point. And also we need to kind of get real on some facts. All right. So before I do that, today I'm wearing a black cap sleeve dress. My hair is down. I'm a pink skin, green eyed, dirty blonde haired woman. I'm in my office in front of my bookcase and my yellow utility cart, coming to you as always from occupied Muncie, Lenape, and Mohegan land. Okay. So where this all began was with ICE raids in California on Thursday. ICE barreled into Los Angeles and started raiding all sorts of businesses and elementary school graduation, and essentially kind of snatching and kidnapping people. And there were, as we've been talking about here now for several weeks, there were spontaneous uprisings for community members, by community members, to protect their neighbors. That then turned into several converging protests at the Metropolitan Detention Center in downtown LA, which, by the way, has been the site of many protests over the years. As a part of that, when the folks were rising up to defend their communities, David Huerta, who is the head of the SEIU California chapter, very powerful, longstanding organizer, was assaulted by ICE, slammed to the ground, hit his head on a cement curb, and was then detained and charged with a crime. All he was literally doing was protesting ICE invading a location in Los Angeles. So the protests converged at Metropolitan Detention. We saw on Friday night that the LAPD got involved and started shooting flash bombs and tear gas and less than lethal munitions, which are referred to as less lethals or dummy bullets, at protesters. And I want to make something really clear, okay? The numbers here are not extreme, okay? The numbers of protesters that we've seen in these several places around Los Angeles, because there was more yesterday, are not large. The estimates are that it's a few hundred protesters at most, okay? An overwhelming degree of law enforcement and ICE force has been deployed in response to this. Okay, so that was Friday night, was downtown Los Angeles. Then yesterday in Paramount, California in LA, ICE raided a Home Depot. And there again were immediate, spontaneous local protests that sprung up that actually blocked ICE into the Home Depot parking lot. They couldn't leave. And this was when Trump and Stephen Miller and their various lackeys decided to call this a riot. Okay, it was not a riot. It was literally people peacefully protesting, many of whom were just holding signs and American flags and getting in the way of ICE trying to leave. That was it. This is, by the way, something that simultaneously was happening in New York City. There were folks who chased ICE vans all the way across Lower Manhattan last night from the downtown detention center there to the Holland Tunnel, which is literally all the way across Lower Manhattan for folks who don't know. This has been very common response to ICE unlawfully kidnapping people off the street and out of courts and out of businesses and out of schools. So as a result of all of this, Trump and his people started to get very agitated that they didn't have control of the situation. And so I just want to point something out here also, okay? If you're so weak that you can't get your own people out of a Home Depot parking lot, you're not actually that much of a threat. And this is one of the things that I think we have to kind of take into consideration here when we look at all of this, all right? So late last night, Trump issued an executive order that did not invoke the Insurrection Act. And this is very significant. What he essentially did was deploy 2,000 National Guard troops into Los Angeles. because he didn't invoke the Insurrection Act, those National Guards people cannot do anything except assist local law enforcement. Okay, that doesn't mean they're in charge of law enforcement itself. They can only help with logistics, essentially. Okay. This was not a declaration of the Insurrection Act. And by the way, then at 2:30 in the morning, Trump posted that, the National Guard had put down this huge riot in LA. The National Guard was not even on the ground in LA last night. So that whole thing is a lie. And 45 minutes later, Mayor Karen Bass of Los Angeles posted that literally there had been no National Guard deployment in LA. And again, protests yesterday, people went home last night, no immediate ongoing risk. This morning, now we know that there are National Guard troops on the ground in LA. All right. So let's just kind of walk through a couple of things about this. All right. The deployment of the National Guard is clearly designed to create a sense of terror inside the United States. But, y'all know I lived in Southern California, just outside of LA, for 6 years. And one of the things that people need to understand about LA is that it's enormous. Okay. I don't even really know how to convey it, especially as a native New Yorker, essentially, how different it is in Los Angeles in terms of land mass and size than it is in, let's say, Manhattan. Okay. So LA County spans more than 4,000 square miles. Okay. It's huge, huge, not square miles. Yes, square miles. That's correct. LA County has more than 9 million people in it. City of Los Angeles is about 2.6, but the county is more than 9 million people. Also, from a geographic standpoint, it's very spread out. And what we have seen here are essentially pop-up protests in various parts of LA County. All right. Not concentrated efforts, not anything overwhelming, right? We're talking a few hundred people here and there who have chanted and berated and taunted ICE using their First Amendment rights, okay? In some instances, stood in front of vans or knocked on the windows of vans, right? But it's not like there's been riots or any overwhelming kinds of fires. And I just have to say, if you lived, I had these moments where I was was anybody not alive during this stuff? Okay, so for instance, if you lived through the LA riots in the early 90s, after the people who beat Rodney King were acquitted, you know what a riot looks like in LA. I had friends on the ground in LA when that was going down, and it was not anything like this, right? There's nothing happening in LA right now that justifies the deployment of the National Guard or even the rollout of the LAPD with less lethals and tear gas, okay? And this has resulted in some really horrible things. Reporters getting hit in the head with tear gas canisters, 13-year-olds being tear gassed, toddlers being tear gassed, people in their cars sitting in traffic because ICE has shut down a street being tear gassed. Not even people who are actually legitimately exercising their First Amendment rights. And, we have instances in New York City where the NYPD pushed someone who may now be paralyzed because they fell down and hit their back and couldn't feel their legs. That was the latest report as of yesterday. I don't have an update on that. So we have to look at, what this looks like. And what it looks like is that the administration has created an incendiary situation. They started this. I want to make this really clear. They sent people into LA, ICE, into LA to unlawfully detain people without any due process from Home Depot parking lots and elementary school graduations and their legitimate places of business. Okay. That's what they did. And the communities around those locations rose up to defend their neighbors through peaceful protest. And now the only people who are escalating this, let's just be really honest about this. The only people who are escalating this is the Trump administration. Even the LAPD, not really well known for de-escalation tactics. Even the LAPD announced last night that the invocation of the National Guard was an escalation that was unnecessary and unjustified by the Trump administration. Okay. So folks need to be really conscious about the fact that none of this was created, accelerated, or continues to be accelerated by any protesters whatsoever. Okay. Now, I said to our Patreon subscribers this morning when I put up the question feed for this broadcast that there's something that's happening on social media right now that's really bothering me. And it's this idea that the protesters should go home, or the protesters should be quiet, or the protesters shouldn't be doing this or shouldn't be doing that because then Trump's going to invoke the Insurrection Act. Okay, so I have news for all of you, okay? It doesn't matter what the protesters do, okay? Trump's going to do what he's going to do. Miller and Homan are going to do what they're going to do, okay? This is not the fault of people who are standing up to defend their neighbors. None of this is their fault. And nothing that the Trump administration does next will be the fault of the protesters, okay? The Trump administration doesn't give a shit about the law. They don't give a shit about the Insurrection Act. They're going to do what they're going to do, okay? And I'm frankly like a little tired and disgusted by all the kind of you better not do this. You should go home at night kind of thing that I'm seeing on social media because people are afraid that Trump's going to invoke the Insurrection Act. Okay, so can I just explain something about the Insurrection Act because I want to make it really clear. What the Insurrection Act does is it allows the U.S. military to take over regular law enforcement forces. So it looks like federal law enforcement in the streets denying people their civil rights. Okay, that's basically what the Insurrection Act looks like. I just have to tell you all, like, if you've seen any of the citizen journalist footage out of LA, you know that that's kind of what's already happening. All right. So this idea that, you know, like an invocation of the Insurrection Act is going to be some kind of horrific disaster, like it's not ideal. I don't want to like downplay it. But at the same time, it's not that very much different from what's happening here. Except for the fact that active duty military could then be called upon to engage in law enforcement activity. All right. Same thing. I just want people to understand, like, oh, he's using this as an excuse to declare martial law. What do people think martial law looks like? Martial law looks like troops in the streets denying people their civil rights. So, you know, there's a lot of noise out there from all of, you know, from people who are kind of buying into the propaganda that says we should all be terribly afraid of this, right? When they're literally all they're doing is sending 2,000 National Guardsmen, people into a county of 9.6 million people that encompasses 4,000 square miles. Okay. You have a choice about whether or not to be terrified by this. And I'm going to tell you, I don't think there's really a reason to be afraid of it. Is it an escalation? Sure. But it also is a demonstration of how freaking weak they are. They can't get their own people out of a Home Depot parking lot. They have to call up the National Guard to get people out of a Home Depot parking lot. Come on. You know, I mean, this is a situation where we have to look at what they're doing as what is fundamentally a show of how weak they really feel and how weak they know they are. They were not anticipating that average everyday people on a moment's notice would drop everything to stand up for their neighbors when ICE stormed into neighborhoods to take people away. They didn't anticipate it. And it's not violent, right? Nobody's doing anything violent to law enforcement, unlike what happened on January 6th, right? When Trump refused to call up the National Guard. This is not that situation, okay? And we really have to be mindful of not falling for the propaganda, okay? Like there were people on the Patreon feed this morning, and I get this because it's like everywhere, but like you don't need to be afraid of him sending 2,000 National Guardsmen into LA. It's not terrifying. You can decide whether or not you're going to like allow them to terrify you, okay? And the other thing I have to say about this is that Pete Hegseth last night said that he was debating calling up the Marines at Camp Pendleton. For those who don't know, that's the military base in San Diego, to handle all of this. Well, deploying active duty Marines to LA is a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. He can't do that. It's illegal. If you declare the Insurrection Act, then you can put active duty military into place, but he can't do that. And I got to tell you, you know, there's a lot of people who have been talking about, does the military have to follow illegal orders? The answer to that is no. There's actually like a GI hotline that they can call in the event that they are issued an illegal order to ask for advice. Same hotline that deals with like, you know, people who don't want to go to war because they're peaceful folks and have religious beliefs. Okay. You don't have to follow an illegal order. And the National Guard and the Marines and the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and everybody who works for the federal government takes an oath of office that says they have to abide by and uphold the Constitution. Not illegal orders from the President of the United States or his lackey who looks like a vampire or, you know, the drunk rapist in charge of the Department of Defense. They don't have to follow illegal orders. Okay, so now I have to pause for a minute and I need to kind of tell you guys a little story because this relates to what we're talking about today. So this morning I was at my UU where the Pride celebration was going on, and my UU is very radical. I've kind of talked about this a little bit here, but, you know, like W.E.B. Du Bois spoke from the pulpit, Mother Jones spoke from the pulpit, Booker T. Washington spoke from the pulpit. It's a very famous old school Universalist Unitarian church. And not even church, congregation is what we call it. And this morning, our pastor got up there and he told the story of Stonewall and how the Stonewall riots began. And I learned something new this morning, which is that in the aftermath of the initial Stonewall uprising, which lasted 5 days in 1969, after the police, at the instruction of a corrupt mayor, went into the Stonewall Inn, fantastic gay bar if you've never been there, and essentially ordered the arrest of the patrons there. And Stonewall Inn was a place that was very trans inclusive, very familiar and welcoming to drag queens, in addition to the fact that it was one of the few gay bars in New York City where you could dance at the time, okay? I learned something new, which is that the police officer, the police lieutenant who was in charge of that night, when they went in and, you know, trans individuals fought back against the cops, punched a cop in the face, right? Threw bricks to defend their rights because they'd had enough of being policed in this way. The police lieutenant had to physically restrain other police officers that night from firing on the patrons of the Stonewall Inn. And when he was interviewed after the fact, what he said was this: I knew I had to do it because what was happening was not right. And even though the law at the time was being broken by people who were gay, because it was still illegal, right? Couldn't wear, like, you know, clothes not conforming with your gender at birth. Even though he knew the law was there and the law was being broken, he said, I had to do it because the law was not right. Okay. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that, you know, I don't have a lot of faith in law enforcement, as you all know. We've talked about this a lot here about, like, you know, the prison industrial complex and the nature of policing in America. But I have to tell you, okay, Camp Pendleton has a lot of people in it who are from San Diego and LA. And it has, like every part of our military, a lot of people of color, okay? What Hegseth is suggesting is that he would call up active duty Marines from Camp Pendleton and order them essentially to police everyday citizens in San Diego and LA, and to do things that fundamentally would violate the Constitution. And I will tell you, I am not at all certain that he's going to get the kind of compliance that he thinks he's going to get if it comes to pass, okay? Because there are still, inside our military, inside our law enforcement, they may be few and far between, but they are there, people who know that being asked to, for instance, open fire on protesting citizens is a step too far. So we don't have any idea how this is all going to play out at this point, right? We have to be very mindful of the propaganda. This is one reason why citizen journalism is so important right now. Please follow people who are recording things on the ground in LA. Okay, this is not being reported in the way that it's actually going down on, like, MSNBC or CNN or any other mainstream media. And at the same time, please remember that just because they may be crossing lines and issuing orders doesn't mean that what they're ordering is actually going to come to pass. Now, again, I have to say, I don't have a huge amount of faith, but I think it's worth noting that there aren't any guarantees that the military would carry out orders like what Hegseth is suggesting, okay? So that's absolutely something to think about here. Okay. Let's see what else. Camp Pendleton. Okay. LAPD. I got you guys there. Got that. I'm checking off all the things I wanted to talk about. Federal Army, federal military cannot do law enforcement. Like, please remember this. The only thing that they can do now that he's federalized this chunk of the National Guard is to assist in logistics for local law enforcement. They can't do it themselves. All right. Again, really critical to remember that. All right. Yeah. And it's designed to terrify you. That's really what it comes down to. It's designed to terrify you, and you should not be afraid. All right. So let's talk for a second about No Kings, because there was many questions on the Patreon feed this morning that were essentially along the lines of, I'm planning on going to my No Kings rally. Is he doing all of this to stop No Kings? No, he's not doing all of this to stop No Kings. He's doing all of this because Stephen Miller is having a bad month. That's why he's doing this, because Stephen Miller a week ago was mad that ICE wasn't rounding people up in Home Depot lots. And here we are, because Stephen Miller is mad that he's not getting his 3,000 arrests of random brown people every day. Okay. He's doing this because Stephen Miller at the moment is in a bit of a pissing match with Elon Musk over his wife. apparently. It's a rumor, but I think there's some truth to it. That's why all of this is happening. Okay. He's not doing this. There's no logic or forethought to this. And the other thing I have to say here is just from a strategic standpoint, like you have to think about this. What's the end game for Trump and Miller by putting 2,000 National Guardsmen into Los Angeles? Like, what's their next plan? What's the next step from this for them? Because if you've got pockets of people all over LA, like there's another protest this morning starting at 11 a.m. in LA. You have pockets of people popping up all over LA in spontaneous protests that either are like immediate when ICE descends or are being organized with a few hours notice. What's their game? What's their long game? Because I'm going to tell you, you would need an overwhelming number of military to put down protests in various locations all over LA with a landmass of that size. So strategically, I just want you to think about this because it's a good moment also to entertain other possibilities. Imagine what would happen if, the National Guard is deployed against U.S. citizens who are lawfully protesting and exercising their First Amendment rights, and what they're trying to do to contain those protesters fails. What kind of a look does that give to the administration, right? What does that do to their sense of strength and to the perceived sense of strength or weakness by everybody else in America? Again, not a very smart long game. Not a very smart long game. Again, this is one of those moments where I have to say to everybody who kind of like attributes this like 5D chess to what they're planning to do, this was not a smart decision. And the other thing I'll just say is that like Governor Newsom objected to it immediately. Karen Bass said it was totally unnecessary, right? So the mayor of LA and the governor of LA, who I'm not a fan of right now, but this is how it went down, don't want him there. They don't want him there. So, this is not a situation where I think they're logically thinking 6 steps ahead, right? I think this is a situation where they got pissed off that there is public opposition to black bagging people out of their elementary school kids' graduations. And they want people to stop protesting. And they're like, ooh, here's a good moment for us to invoke the National Guard. It's like they've all been having these violent fantasies in their head. And now they're like, let's do that with no long game and no plan whatsoever. Okay. So again, really important to remember that they're not doing this to like squelch protest in other parts of the country. No Kings is in hundreds of locations next Saturday around the country. There's no way they're going to be able to they're not going to send people in to put down a peaceful No Kings protest in every town in America. All right. You do not need to be afraid of showing up and holding a sign and chanting for democracy. All right. Now, I will advise you, as I have advised everybody who's engaging in protest right now, and as I myself have done, to please take the safety trainings that are available through Indivisible in advance of No Kings. They have safety trainings coming up. They have Know Your Rights trainings coming up this week. You can go to Indivisible's website, click through to No Kings, and you will find those scheduled virtual events. You should attend them because it's always good when you're going into a protest to know how to protect yourself and the people around you, to know how to access the safety coordinators who are on the ground, right? To know who's organizing your particular protest where you live, and also to know your rights. Always smart. But I don't think anybody should be dissuaded from going out on June 14th because of this. And, I'm just going to say one other thing. If you kind of are dissuaded from that, that's what they want, right? They want people to stay home, not unify, not protest, not organize, not show up in their own communities because they're too afraid. 2,000 National Guard in a county of 9.6 million people. So again, you got to be really thoughtful about making sure that you know what's going on where you live, but they're not going to be able to put down No Kings. That's not going to happen. Okay. Somebody asked a question about infiltration. All right. So you all will remember back during the George Floyd uprising in 2020, there was a lot of footage in Minneapolis after a couple of days of people dressed all in black, carrying umbrellas and smashing windows. All right. And those folks, since, in some instances at least, were identified as being from white supremacist organizations that were there to try to escalate violence against protesters. We haven't seen anything like that in LA. And I also just have to say that, one of the things to remember here is that the manner in which infiltration happens is way more subtle than I think what people are thinking about. Like, this week we learned, for instance, that there are universities, whole universities, University of Michigan, that has been infiltrating student groups to try to figure out who is organizing for Gaza. One of the things that we need to be very mindful of here is that, like, infiltration, like, all you have to do is like become familiar with COINTELPRO. If you don't know what that is, you should go research it. They infiltrated MLK's movement. They infiltrated Malcolm X's movement. They set out to kind of like, surveil and destroy the Black Panther Party. You have to understand that this stuff is a lot more subtle than I think what some people are imagining right now. We don't have any evidence on the ground of anybody acting in a way that is overtly violent against the police. The most that we have is people throwing back canisters of tear gas at the police after they've been deployed at peaceful protesters. That's it. Now, does that mean you shouldn't be mindful? No, of course you should be mindful, right? I mean, infiltration can happen anywhere, but I'm going to tell you it's more likely to happen at your local community organizational meeting than it is to happen, like, in the middle of a spontaneous protest, because law enforcement doesn't tend to move that fast. Okay. So again, be very mindful about this. Of course, you should have your wits about you. If something doesn't smell right in your organizing, you should pay attention to that. We have an educational video coming right here on this channel tomorrow that talks about how to vet the people you're organizing with. That'll drop at noon Eastern tomorrow. So you can watch all of that and it'll tell you everything you need to know. But this is not a situation where we're seeing kind of like the same sorts of things that we saw in like day 4, day 5 in Minneapolis of the George Floyd uprising, where very clearly there were outside agitators there committing acts of violence to try to, cause law enforcement to get worse. Okay. Couple final thoughts. We do have ongoing protests today in LA. We also have seen protesters mobilizing for an Occupy ICE event in Portland overnight. That is something to pay attention to. Obviously, there are ongoing protests in Foley Square in New York City because people were being snatched out of immigration court there this week. I expect that those will continue. They were continuing as of last night. That's not counting everything that's happened in San Diego and Minneapolis and Massachusetts and all these other various places where individuals are rising up. There's an event in Chicago today, right? A big mass protest against ICE coming into communities and essentially like kidnapping people. It's very important, by the way, to make sure that you get bystander intervention training as soon as possible. And I will just tell you that Vision Change Win, which you can Google, that's Vision Change Win, offers bystander intervention training online like pretty much on a weekly basis. It's a good idea to do that just in case, to know like how and when you can intervene without potentially putting people in harm's way. Very important to make sure that you are being thoughtful about what's going to happen when ICE comes to your town, because it's going to happen. I mean, there's dozens of people in this audience where it's already happened. And so think about how you're going to get involved. I mean, this is one reason why after the election, the very first stuff that I started doing here locally was getting involved in a statewide coalition of immigration justice organizations. And I get notifications. I can't always join, but I get notifications every week from them for organizing calls. At least you know what's going on the ground. All right. That kind of stuff is really critical right now for your own organizing. And you should make sure that you know who's doing immigration justice work where you live. Okay. But all that said, the biggest message that I got to tell you guys right now is that, the Trump administration at the moment is looking exceedingly weak on this. And they're putting on this great show of force and, doing Trump's military parade. The other thing I just have to say is like, somebody asked me like, well, are those tanks going to stay in the city in DC? I don't know what people think that the tanks are going to do that, groups of law enforcement officers can't do right now. Okay. They're not going to I don't know. I think people have like images from Tiananmen Square and assume that like that's going to happen on the National Mall. Never say never, but I highly doubt it. All right. And again, it's illegal, absent an invocation of the Insurrection Act, to deploy U.S. military against U.S. citizens. So all that said, one thing that I just want to make really clear about all of this is that we can expect more response because they are so weak, because they are totally unprepared for average everyday U.S. citizens to intervene when ICE descends on their neighborhoods. They didn't expect this, right? They're calling like people who are standing there with American flags and signs terrorists and violent, and there's no evidence for that. Okay, no evidence for it. So they're the ones who are manufacturing this crisis, and unfortunately, they're kind of getting their asses kicked in LA, which is the reason why they're rolling out the National Guard. So again, my takeaways from all of this, which I'm here to share with you all, of course, is that I don't think they're winning this one right now. And that's the reason why they're so agitated and upset about it and using such incendiary and inflammatory language. Because they're, like I said, their own people got boxed into a Home Depot parking lot and they couldn't get them out. Like, that's not federal law enforcement that knows what it's doing. So I think there are reasons right now to be optimistic. Also, I think we got to have the back of everybody who's standing up for their friends and neighbors and family members in LA. You know, they are incredibly brave people. Many of you have seen the footage of the skater who got hit with like 12 tear gas canisters and still walked out. Please do not try to identify that guy. Nobody needs to know who he is. Okay. These are incredibly brave people who are standing up for the right thing, right? For the rights of people to like live and be free and be with their families and work their jobs and, you know, like be in a place where they were trying to build a better life, right? That's what's happening. Like, make no mistake about it. And, you know, the protesters are kind of winning. So I think we have a lot of reason to be hopeful and optimistic. And I think that there's an incredibly important mindset that has to happen around this, which is like, we're going to refuse to be cowed and refuse to be terrified by Trump invoking 2,000 National Guard troops. And, you know, also please keep in mind that the only people who have escalated anything here is Trump and his people. Like, that's it. That's it. So all power to the people on the ground in LA. I know there are some LA people who are watching. I just want to say this, like, thank you. I have friends in LA who have been talking about how LA has this. I want to thank everybody who's doing that work. I want to thank everybody who's planning on going to a No Kings event on Saturday. You know, please do your part and get your safety training, but you know, like, let's show up. I mean, and these spontaneous protests are a good thing. They're a really good thing. So mad gratitude to everybody who's standing up for what's right. And I will be back live on Tuesday. Like I said, we have an educational video dropping at noon tomorrow on how to vet the people that you're organizing with. So you all can catch that. Many thanks to our Patreon subscribers for all the questions they gave us this morning. And, yeah, hang in there, people. It's going to be okay. And it might get worse before it gets better, but there are a lot of signs right now that like the people are winning. And I think we got to hang on to that. All right, my friends, lots of love. I will see you all back here live on Tuesday. Hang in there.